This episode is presented by Invest Puerto Rico. If you believe your business can go anywhere, Puerto Rico is the place.
Hello and welcome back to Equity, TechCrunch's flagship podcast about the business of startups. Today is Friday, February 14th. Happy Valentine's Day, everybody. I'm Kirsten Korosek, transportation editor at TechCrunch.
I'm Max Zeff, senior reporter at TechCrunch.
And I'm Anthony Ha, the weekend editor at TechCrunch.
All right, we're all here. Max, I thought of you the other day because it was AI related, of course. And I saw that the Reuters AI case has been settled. Have you been following that case at all?
Well, first off, I'm really devastated to hear that my name is just associated with AI chatbots now. But yes, I did hear about it. So we haven't written about this, but Thomson Reuters won an AI copyright lawsuit against a legal AI startup. And this is a big deal in some ways because it's one of the first AI copyright lawsuits where, an AI system was basically found guilty for, using someone else's copyrighted material. But it doesn't use generative AI systems, which is a key distinction. So it doesn't necessarily have huge implications for the New York Times case, OpenAI's case against New York Times, Meta's case with book authors. So we'll still have to see how those play out. But it's kind of a slight distinction there, but an important one between, simple AI systems and these large language models.
Max, my understanding from reading about the case was that it's not generative AI, but it does involve sort of the definition of fair use that a lot of the generative AI companies are using. So they're not exactly the same thing, but this might set some precedent.
I think that's what everyone's kind of wondering, and that's what legal scholars are kind of batting back and forth right now. The key thing about the generative AI versus AI with fair use is that the generative AI companies are claiming that LLMs transform this, training data that they uptake into something new, whereas these more traditional AI systems kind of just spit them back out. So I think that's really kind of the argument that we're going to see in the next couple court cases. But it remains to be seen. This is definitely a win in the right direction for copyright holders. So,
well, the good news is for all of our listeners that we're going to talk about AI several more times in the show. But first, let's do a rundown of the show today. We have deals of the week from buy now, pay later startup Tabby and Archer Aviation's recent $300 million raise. And then we're going to get into our two themes, which will cover Elon's bid to buy OpenAI and the Paris AI Action Summit. See, I promised AI was back in the show. First up, Anthony, talk to me about Tabby. Really interesting buy now, pay later company.
Yeah, that's right. Tabby raised $160 million at a $3.3 billion valuation. It's one of those companies where I see the headline and I feel embarrassed because I'm like, how have I never heard of this company before? But as you said, Kirsten, it's a buy now, pay later company headquartered in Saudi Arabia. And I think is sort of an indication of the potential that, I guess is now being realized, but also that investors see for buy now, pay later in the Middle East. It's, I guess, part of the argument for why it's particularly promising in regions in sort of the developing world is that there's not necessarily the same level of credit card penetration. And so basically the different form of credit, right? And a different way to sort of make these kinds of purchases. Whereas, I think there's a lot of excitement about buy now, pay later in the US, but also I think some of the companies have had a rockier road. So yeah, I think it's just kind of exciting to see the opportunities that are kind of popping up in the Middle East.
Yeah, fintech is so interesting in terms of a marketplace in places like South America, Africa, and other places where there isn't necessarily the same banking system set up. So it just seems like the buy now, pay later idea and the marketplace is so much stronger in areas like the Middle East. This is one of those moments where we want to tap our senior reporter, Marianne, over here because she is like the fintech master. But I'm wondering if you're seeing any promise or activity in the buy now, pay later market in North America, or if this deal is indicative of more strength in sort of the Middle East and in other emerging markets?
I mean, it seems like on just like a high level, my sense of it is that there's certainly a lot of activity. There are companies that are raising, that are seeing some success, but also have maybe kind of overextended themselves a little bit in North America. And so I'm always a little hesitant to get too authoritative about, exactly how things are playing out.
Make a declaration, Anthony. Come on, you can do it.
Yeah. So I don't know that it's comparative, but certainly like it makes sense to me that maybe some of the challenges that companies are facing in the US, just because the US is it's so weird in so many ways right now, that there might be a slightly smoother path in other regions.
Anthony, I mean, I'm always skeptical of companies that want to take your money and give you a little bit of free money in the short term. But I'm curious kind of what you're seeing more broadly. Marianne just did a great interview with Shield Monat, which is a VC in the fintech space. And I'm curious kind of what you're seeing for, Klarna, Deal, and Stripe and these bigger fintech players in terms of, IPOs or valuation raises in the next year.
Yeah, I mean, I'm doing my best to put on my Marianne hat right now. And the sense I get is sort of like cautious optimism that, again, that there's hope for more fundraises, potentially even going public. But there's definitely like issues, right? And I thought the interview with Sheil was great. Obviously, Sheil, I think it has a little bit of an interest in getting people excited about fintech. And I think one sign of just sort of the uncertainty is you are seeing these companies also trying to figure out where the other opportunities are. I mean, with Stripe, which is a slightly different company, but because it's so ubiquitous as a payments company online, they have to figure out what the next big thing is. And so they're moving into crypto. And, I don't know that that's necessarily a bad move, but I think you see them kind of hitting what I think is maybe like a plateau with their existing business models and then being like, okay, well, in order to justify the valuation of the next raise or to justify a great valuation going public or a great market cap going public, we have to figure out more than that. And I should mention, by the way, that, we've been talking about Tabby as a buy now, pay later company, which it started out as, I think it still is primarily, but it has been moving into other fintech services as well.
That is interesting. And it is like the perfect segue, even though these two companies have literally nothing to do with each other, except for this commonality of finding new products or new areas in order to raise money and also get customers. And I'm talking about Archer Aviation. This is a company that is developing electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft. And if one of our former colleagues was here, Devin, who's no longer at TechCrunch, would say it's a helicopter, but it's not. And this is a company that just raised $300 million round from BlackRock and Wellington. But the reason for raising that money is pretty interesting and really gets down to that dual use trend that we're hearing so much about.
So, Kirsten, I'm just really curious, as someone who's not super familiar on the space, I will say that this does look like a helicopter, but also I'm not familiar with the dual use kind of thing here. I mean, wasn't this company, making like consumer facing vehicles before? Like, what's going on here?
Yeah. So first of all, eVTOL market, which is the acronym for electric vertical takeoff and landing vehicles, is an emerging market. All of these companies are still in the process of getting their Type 1 certification from the FAA. So there's a lot to be said about this. So, this is not necessarily companies that are giving rides to anyone. But Archer did start and the original core mission was an electric aviation startup to develop air taxis. So imagine these vertiports on top of buildings and, you're flying in between and it's sort of like cutting out traffic. And that was the original vision. But what's happened here is they've been building out some defense applications. And this piece, this 300 million is very much connected to that. So the latest round of funding is going to go towards this project with Anduril and support scaling production at Archer's Georgia factory. And a big piece of it is doing this hybrid, so non-electric, all-electric VTOL for defense purposes. So you're seeing what's happening, I think, actually all around the deep tech space, but specifically in future of flight and autonomous vehicles, turning to the DoD for opportunities as another revenue stream, because in a lot of cases, they're pretty far off from commercialization.
And I mean, I think we've been talking a lot, like every week, about, tech companies turning to defense for new sources of revenue. And I keep asking the same question, but I think it's a good one that's worth digging into. It's like, is this because of the Trump administration coming in, wanting to ramp up some sort of defense spending, or is this just a broader trend that's going on in the EV space right now?
I think it's a broader trend that is now being augmented or accelerated because of the Trump administration and, quite frankly, a lot of Silicon Valley players that have a much larger platform and connections to the Trump administration who were already sort of on this road. So I think we're seeing it in particular in areas where there is no present day revenue stream, and there is absolutely a guaranteed need for more capital in order to get that tech to commercialization. And the two areas that I am, most embedded in is going to be in future of flight and also autonomous vehicles. But you're seeing it in space as well, which I'm not as deeply informed about, but certainly our coverage shows that. So we'll see, for instance, Archer's rivals in this space like Joby Aviation and Beta Technologies also have military contracts to test their aircraft for surveillance, logistics, and reconnaissance missions. And this is stuff that's been happening long before, Trump was reelected.
Do you think that defense has become just less of a taboo in Silicon Valley in recent years?
Yeah. And by the way, I just saw I see Anthony nodding along like, yeah. In all the years I've been covering tech, Anthony, and I want to hear your take, just generally speaking, because you've been covering tech as long as I have. To me, the last 2 years is so wildly different from where people's comfort level is. Like, would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a little bit of a challenge to talk about because I think it's this overlapping Venn diagram of things where it's related to Trump, of course, and sort of this rightward swing in Silicon Valley. But it's also just been, I think, a number of founders who maybe are Trump adjacent or Trump curious, but just in general have sort of kind of come out and said, hey, like, I think that defense is a valid area for, startups to be building in. I think Palantir, which again is sort of defense, but not a traditional defense company, I think was like sort of paving the way, but then Anduril and it seems like now there's just a whole bunch of founders kind of following in those footsteps.
Yeah. And I would also say that it's a reflection of our modern world, which is there wasn't that long ago that, defense felt more like guns and ammunition. And that is so different now. It's software, it's cybersecurity, it's certainly AI, and there's all sorts of other deep tech that we're seeing. Here's a funny story just to reflect how much it's changed. I remember probably 9 years ago, I was at this kind of what I would describe as like the Kitty Hawk of self-driving vehicles event. And it was a little bit of a hobbyist event. And people were out at Thunderhill Racing in California trying to get vehicles around the track autonomously. And it was a bunch of hobbyists, but also kind of big companies were there. It was really interesting. And I met this guy and he was kind of wandering around and I was like, oh, what are you doing? And he's like, yeah, I'm with In-Q-Tel. And I'm like, oh, interesting. And so In-Q-Tel, of course, is the venture arm of the CIA. And I'm like, oh, you finding anything interesting? And he's like, yeah, but not everyone really wants to talk to me right now. And that is sharply different than what is happening today, where people are absolutely interested in talking to In-Q-Tel and the Department of Defense. And it just reflects, I think, our changing world, but absolutely accelerated by the Trump administration.
Yeah. And I think that, this ties into something we're going to talk about later on the show with just kind of changing values in the AI space, which I'm excited to dig into later.
Yeah. And when we get back from the break, we are going to dig into that OpenAI, Elon tussle. I don't know. Can we call it a tussle? And also an update on what happened at the Paris AI Action Summit.
What's next in innovation? That's not the right question. It's where. Puerto Rico, more than just a tropical paradise, it's innovation's paradise, where startups and global players coexist in a vast and vibrant ecosystem, where talent runs deep, highly skilled and bilingual. Plus, the island offers the most competitive tax incentives in the US. If you believe your business can go anywhere, Puerto Rico is the place. Find out more at investpr.org/equity.
It feels very like aggressive what's happening with Elon Musk and Sam Altman. Max, please catch us up on the latest.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe like people have been comparing it to like Kendrick and Drake. It's like beef. Like I wouldn't quite call that like a tussle. It's kind of like a diss track, like, you know, rap battle sort of, I would say. So basically, Elon Musk just offered nearly $100 billion to buy OpenAI's nonprofit governing entity. He is planning to make this kind of offer. It's funded partially by XAI, and he's got some outside investors. Do they have $100 billion? I think that's kind of remains to be seen.
Sure, why not? Why not?
Yeah, whatever. You know, we're going to build a $500 billion data center in Arizona to, you know, power OpenAI's, you know, AI. Let's also just throw out $100 billion bids to buy it. Who knows where this money is coming from? Does it exist? Sure. So, here's why it matters. Elon Musk was a co-founder of OpenAI. He's also suing them, saying that they're falling back on their mission. And the reason he did this, which Kyle Wiggers and I wrote an in-depth article about, the reason he gave this offer was basically to, mess up OpenAI's for-profit conversion. OpenAI is trying to basically spin out its for-profit arm into its own company that's not under the control of this nonprofit. This is going to allow it to one day go public. This is kind of a crucial thing for someone raising as much money as OpenAI. And by Elon Musk offering $100 billion for the nonprofit, he's kind of set a market price in a certain way for what this is worth. And now OpenAI is going to have to pay the nonprofit a certain amount of money, basically to buy its for-profit assets, the controlling shares back from it. And it just made it way more expensive. So it basically is going to open the door to, all of these legal challenges in the future. But really, this is just like a complicated legal setup for the next stage of the battle between Elon Musk and Sam Altman. And Anthony, I'm curious, kind of, you've covered these guys for a long time. I mean, does this feel like par for the course, or does it feel like they're ramping up right now?
I mean, it seems like an escalation, and interesting to see the kind of back and forth between them, because again, I'm sorry that it just feels like we just say Trump and AI over and over again in this episode. But there was also this New York Times story about how Max, you, I think, alluded to the Stargate project. Is that what it's called?
Yes.
And, that he's in some ways kind of reportedly done an end run around Musk to kind of get federal support for this data center project. And so it seems like they're just competing on a lot of different fronts right now. And OpenAI is kind of like the core of that disagreement. I mean, again, if we tried to give the full backstory, that would just be an episode on its own. But one of the things that is relevant is the fact that XAI, I think, is pretty transparently was founded just because Musk was not happy about the direction of OpenAI and was like, I'm going to start my own competitor to OpenAI. And if it's okay to sort of answer a question with a question mask, I think one of the things I wanted to ask you was, and that I've been trying to get an answer from other people about, is it makes sense for Musk to do this as sort of to throw a wrench in the for-profit conversion process. But he also has made a takeover offer, which, again, who knows about exactly the funding of it. But is there a significant chance that this ends with Musk in control of OpenAI again?
So, I mean, everyone I've talked to basically has said that that's not going to happen. I mean, Sam Altman publicly rejected the offer immediately and kind of took it as a chance to dunk on Elon. OpenAI's board chair basically went on stage with the Wall Street Journal and said, we're not for sale. So I don't think that it's very likely that this happens. I think it was honestly more so kind of this legal footwork that Elon is kind of known for to really just mess with their conversion. That said, the last takeover bid that he submitted was for Twitter. And we all know how that ended up. If you've been on X, you can see that it is very Elon-centric now. But Kirsten, I wanted to ask you you've covered a lot of the kind of Tesla governance battles over the years. And I mean, Elon is so good at these kinds of legal battles and just tripping people up. And do you feel like he has gotten better at it over the years, or is he has
100%.
a super team of lawyers?
No, he doesn't necessarily have a super team of lawyers. I mean, one of his main lawyers, Alex Spiro, has been very successful. But I would say that First of all, I have to say, absolutely love the fact, total nerd alert, that like Sam Altman's response was just to move the decimal point and offer 9.74 billion for Twitter, which, reminder, Elon bought Twitter. I think it was for about $44 billion. So anyway, that made me laugh. Elon's playbook in general, and what people need to understand, and I think that people are understanding it more than ever now, is that I have never encountered in all my years of reporting, and I've interviewed Elon in group press conference settings and at least once or maybe twice, just one-on-one, someone who enjoys risk more than anyone I've ever encountered. I mean, he's just not risk averse. Trump is actually quite similar. And I think it was either Dan Primack on Axios or Mike Allen, but kind of talked about maximalist masculinity as like this trademark that has worked very well, which is just going the place where no one would normally go and kind of trying to see if they can call people's bluff. He has been very successful on that in terms of governance of Tesla and also other deals, whether he has any, and also Twitter, but he had some inroads in already an existing platform or, audience on Twitter and quite a bit of sway. I don't really see that with OpenAI. He would have to get quite a few people with power and backers that have invested in OpenAI to come to him for that deal to happen. So I don't really see it as probable at all. But I would say that with other companies, he's been quite successful with these sort of very open forums of declaring that he will indeed buy something.
Yeah, I think just the context here is that, the thing Elon is really says he's mad about is that OpenAI has fallen back on its promise to open source, all of its code and just be a free and transparent AI nonprofit, which is what it was founded to do. But of course, it's come a long way since then. And I feel like these lofty missions at tech companies, it's a story we've just heard over again. At Google, at Facebook, it's like, yes, it starts out with this bunch of kids who want to do something great for the world. And then, boom, now you're offered $100 billion for your company and just things change.
It changes. And speaking of changes, by the way, next theme I want to kind of get into is we had some folks on the ground in Paris at the AI Action Summit, and it used to be focused all about safety. Now it's all about action and opportunity. It seemed like a pretty big shift. I don't know, like Max, have you followed this summit in previous years? And is this like a sudden dramatic change, or has this been kind of like creeping towards this for a while?
Yeah, I talked to some people who were at the summit. I think that the gist is that this was supposed to be called the AI Safety Summit, and then they changed the name to the AI Action Summit to be less negative, and I think that that's just really representative of the content of it. JD Vance said on stage there that he didn't want to talk about AI safety. He wanted to talk about AI opportunity. And Emmanuel Macron, the French president, said, we're back in the race. And that's not exactly what you think you would hear at an AI safety summit. I mean, Anthony, you covered the kind of vetoing of SB 1047, this AI safety bill. And I mean, it seems like we're just seeing a broader trend where these AI safety movements are just really dying down right now.
I think that certainly you're getting a lot of different voices now. I think maybe who are a little bit louder, and there's an understandable, I don't know if I agree with it, but certainly understandable pushback of like you said, so much of the conversation was about AI is exciting, but it's this really dangerous technology. And sort of how do we control it? How do we put guardrails around it? And I think it seems like a whole variety of reasons, the conversation has moved on a little bit from that. I mean, we'll see whether or not that turns out well for society. And I mean, I think the other thing that was really striking to me was, over the weekend before the summit itself, it just seemed like everyone was sort of putting out their own statements ahead of it. And I mean, it was interesting to go through them, but it was also a little bit of a head scratcher for me because so many of the statements were so general and so broad that I really couldn't figure out okay, who wants what, right? Like, what are the different camps here? And I'm curious, Max, for you, again, answering a question with a question, but do you have a sense of are there schisms within the people at the summit or the different countries, the different companies at the summit in terms of different directions that they want AI to move in, or are people largely on the same page?
there's a large crowd of people who still want to push for this, focus on the existential risks that large AI systems pose. I think there are always going to be that group of people. Anthropic's CEO said that this whole large global summit was just a missed opportunity because we could have talked about safety with some global leaders here, but we didn't. Instead, we talked about how great every country's AI is. But I think generally right now, this is the direction that things are going. Like, I think that, OpenAI, which started out as this AI safety focused lab, they just announced yesterday that they are now going to start embracing quote unquote intellectual freedom in their AI models, which means basically that they're going to answer controversial questions in their AI chatbots, and they're going to represent both viewpoints, kind of this view from nowhere. And I think that just 6 months ago, that would have been a really unpopular decision because it would have been seen as you're going to, give air to all these conspiracy theories and you're going to kind of provide information about potentially dangerous things. But now there's just this free speech kind of pivot, this deregulation pivot that we're just seeing around the world right now, but specifically when it comes to AI.
I'm very curious to see how this plays out because it will either continue to push the needle or I guess the bar to a place where we never thought we would be, 2 years ago, or something dramatic will happen that will freak enough people out that they'll sort of abruptly stop the, let's say, not anti-safety talk, but like downplaying the safety piece. So we'll see. Everything's moving so quickly. It's really shocking. I will say this. One of our reporters, Ramon Delay, was there, and he had some great sort of boots on the ground insight and gossip that I want to share. But also he had some really good insights that he posted on LinkedIn. And I think he'll be writing a longer story about it. So keep an eye out for that. But he did say that Sam Altman was at the dinner on Monday evening with these dozens of global tech leaders and CEOs. And that's when Musk made the offer to acquire OpenAI, and he left dinner early. So I guess he saw that. Also, JD Vance apparently left dinner as the vice prime minister of China was about to speak. And some people were kind of wondering if that was highlighting some tensions. I think all of this and then what we're actually seeing play out on the public stage is really indicative of how quickly things are moving and how specific groupthink is splitting. The ones like Anthropic's CEO who are really quite concerned about safety, and the ones who are saying that this will basically hurt us and the sort of American dynamism movement.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think, first of all, I think on the safety front, one thing that I always keep coming back to is also to remind people that I think safety itself is something that encompasses a pretty broad spectrum. And I think there are people, frankly, like me, who I think I'm a lot more freaked out at the short-term risk of AI and what that means for like the labor market and things like that versus like Skynet, which, I think is also worth being scared about, but maybe is not as immediate a concern. But I guess also, to be fair to the side that is more like, let's just the American dynamism side, the like, let's really pursue this with fewer guardrails. The argument on that side that I imagine, there's also obviously a bit of a fire that's been lit under them that I think you guys talked about last week or maybe the week before around DeepSeek and just this sense of like AI is happening as part of this broader geopolitical stage. And like, yeah, it might be great if we try to, keep AI super safe in the United States. But like, if then China sort of wins this battle, quote unquote, if you care about sort of, again, a lot of scare quotes here, but about like American values and like safety and things like that, China sort of dominating in AI is not going to be a great outcome either. I don't necessarily agree with that, but I did want to at least sort of say, I think that is part of the argument here. It's not just about profit, although I think profit is a big part of it.
Yeah, it's not just money and opportunity, but it's, do we want to cede control to China? And is that less safe than, say, going full ahead without guardrails on AI development? I'm sure that we'll be back next week to talk about more on the AI front, but other things too. So thanks again to Max and Anthony for joining. We will be back next week. Until then, you can find Equity under the handle @EquityPod on X and Threads.
Equity is produced by Theresa Loconsolo with editing by Kell. We'd also like to thank TechCrunch's audience development team. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.